Okay, hi there, and welcome to a new growth and development profile video in which we look at Cambodia, which over the last 2 decades has been one of the fastest growing countries in the world and within the Southeast Asian region. Cambodia is located in Southeast Asia. It borders Laos, Thailand and Vietnam. It's got a very young population of around 16 million people, but that's expected to increase by more than 1 million by 2020. Cambodia continues to achieve, as it has done over the last 2 decades, extremely rapid growth. It's another member of what I'm calling the 7% club, countries whose growth rates average just about 7% per year. And as this chart shows, it's near the summit of the forecast growth for 2019, published recently by the Asian Development Bank. Their medium-term aim in Cambodia is to gain the high benefits from membership of ASEAN economic integration, the single market being developed within that region, and also to become an upper middle income country by 2030. They've just been assigned lower middle income status, that was in 2015. This is a quick comparison with development groups. You can see Cambodia's GNI per capita in dollars, adjusted for PPP, is now $3,500, above the low human development baseline, but a little bit below the median human development baseline. Cambodia, in fact, has managed to translate some of that growth into better development outcomes. It has the 8th fastest rate of HGI growth, which suggests that some of the spillovers from growth are being fed through into it in terms of extreme poverty reduction and improved education and health outcomes. Just simply in terms of poverty reduction, that per capita income of $3,500 was enough to bring down extreme poverty from 48% in 2007 to 13.5% in 2014. There's actually also been a measured fall in inequality in the Gini coefficient over the same period. The other indicator I'm showing there is remittances, and Cambodia is a significant recipient of remittance incomes, particularly from many people who've left Cambodia and live and work in neighbouring Thailand. Remittance inflows are significantly above the level for low and medium human development countries. What we do in this little section is we look at 20 development indicators. I'm not going to look at every single one, but Cambodia is now 146 in terms of HGI ranking. That ranking's gone up. It's improved, in other words, in recent times. However, one of the significant development barriers is a high rate of child malnutrition. There are millions of people in Cambodia who are near poor, and nearly a third of children under the age of 5 have moderate or severe stunted growth. Another aspect which I've highlighted is the very high level of foreign direct investment. If you take a 5-year average, FDI into Cambodia has averaged over 11% of GDP. That's one of the highest in the world, and well worth using as an example in your economics essays. On other indicators, we don't actually have data on the income share of the bottom 10 and 40%, which is 10%. In terms of median age, Cambodia has a very young population, median age of just over 25 years. It's also a very open economy. If you add together the value of exports and imports, they sum to more than 120% of GDP. So Cambodia has this reputation as being a small, highly open, very young economy that's tapping into the shifts in global manufacturing, particularly in certain key sectors. On the macro side, inflation under control, unemployment very low, 1%. Now, the reason for the low rate of unemployment, according to the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is that the majority, perhaps 4 people out of 5 in Cambodia, are employed in the informal sector. And often that's unregistered, unregulated and low paid. So although the unemployment rate in Cambodia is very low, as it is in neighbouring Vietnam, in fact there must be and there will be a lot of underemployment and hidden unemployment. Current account balance minus 10%, another example of a country here with a very high current account deficit, in part because of a construction boom in Vietnam and Cambodia, construction boom in Cambodia, which of course is sucking in a lot of imported components and raw materials, which Cambodia can't necessarily produce themselves. And it's another example of a country where the investment rate, 23% of GDP, is significantly higher than the gross national savings rate, suggesting a savings gap which needs to be funded. One of the features of Cambodia is that there's been a rising share of world exports. They're not the world's biggest exporting country, but you can see the progress here shown in red. Really good example to use of a country which is using export-led growth, particularly in garments, increasingly in tourism, to drive their growth. And again, if you look at the trade pattern for goods, green dominates this chart. So in other words, in fact, something like 3/4 of their exports of goods are in garments, leather and textiles. Indeed, 50% of their exports go to just 5 countries: USA, UK, Japan, Germany and France. So Cambodia has built and is using a comparative advantage in the textile industry, the garment industry in particular. It's clearly benefited from fast growth and increasing regional trade in Southeast Asia, but also the ability to sell garments at a low cost, low price to Western markets. Oftentimes you'll find your sportswear, Nike, Puma, Adidas, is made in Cambodia. And this is where they sell their exports to. Again, they're getting good access to those big, rich markets of European Union, United States, Japan, yes, China, but also Canada as well. So there are essentially 4 key growth drivers for Cambodia at the moment. This 7% club, what's driving their GDP growth? Big investment in and output of the garment sector, increased revenue from tourism, which we'll mention in a second or two. There has been a construction and real estate boom, adding to physical demand for new buildings. And because they've reached lower middle income status, $3,500 per capita, and because their population is young and growing, that is providing an underpinning, if you like, an increase in consumer demand. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The garment sector is particularly important for Cambodia. This is something I would really stress in the exams. A great example to use. 75% of exports of goods. I think it provides nearly 800,000 jobs for females in the garment sector. It's a big contributor to rural-urban migration. And of course, there's a big issue the extent to which these kind of jobs pay wages and employment which are productive. Tourism also quite important. As you can see from this chart, the share of tourism revenues in GDP is rising significantly. It's now nearly 6%. So I beg your pardon, nearly 15% of GDP. Significant investment in eco-tourism. I think they've got about 50 eco-tourism sites in operation. Some of them, of course, are major national attractions like Angkor Wat. They have 7 national parks. They have 9 wildlife sanctuaries. So tourism has grown dramatically in Cambodia. Its share of GDP has actually gone up from 6%, as you can see here, to over 16% over this period. China is the biggest source of foreign direct investment inflows. In fact, 50% of all the inflows of FDI into Cambodia comes from China, 90% from Asia. So it's a country which is open to investment, but that investment comes from essentially really quite a bit from Korea as well, but essentially from just a few countries. Structure of GDP for Cambodia is quite interesting. Key change here is the 10% increase over the last decade in the share of Cambodian GDP that comes from industry, including garment manufacturing. The share of farming has declined by a similar percentage, although it remains the dominant source of income, output and jobs for people living in rural Cambodia. And here's the share of employment, which essentially matches what's been happening. Over 40% of people now employed in services, including tourism and financial services. The share of employment in manufacturing has gone up from 20% to 46%. The share of employment in farming, agriculture, down from 44% to 30%. Mentioned remittances. The value of remittances reached $1 billion in 2013. It's now up to $1.4 billion. Many Cambodian families rely on remittances, particularly from relatives in neighbouring Thailand, and often those remittances are used to pay back debts rather than increase consumer spending. Garments, construction, tourism are the dominant key growth drivers for Cambodia, as this chart shows. One aspect of the garment export boom, though, is that the share of locally sourced components is actually fairly low. So Cambodia has a high propensity to import things like cotton and other materials, so that the multiplier effects of the fast-growing export sector in garments is probably smaller than it might be. As we've said with FDI, most of the garment manufacturers in Cambodia are foreign owned, so the profits from those operations go back to other countries, including China and South Korea. Cambodia's competitiveness rankings are quite interesting. They're ranked 106th of all the countries listed by the World Forum, and they have a reasonably strong ranking in terms of labour markets. But actually, neighbouring Vietnam is 77th, Thailand is 38th. So Cambodia has quite a job to do to improve their overall economic competitiveness beyond just being a centre for low-cost garment manufacturing. The labour market is ranked 65th, a young and fast-growing population, but they're much worse on infrastructure, which is creaking, and also innovation capability, 102nd. So what are the key growth constraints and risks for Cambodia? Well, it's a fast-growing country, but we know that every time we look at a fast-growing economy, there are always some headwinds and some development barriers to overcome. One is the big environmental threat. There is a plastic pollution crisis affecting Cambodia. In part, limited access to fresh water means that millions of them have to use plastic bottles for their water. Coastal areas particularly affected. That is a major environmental externality issue to be aware of. There is a property boom at the moment, but a lot of the lending is unregulated, and the fear, of course, that this real estate boom could easily collapse, causing a wider slump. Cambodia's export base is too narrow. It's heavily focused on garments, and that is exposed to external shocks such as global protectionism. What happens if Cambodia loses some of its preferential market access to the United States and to the European Union? High level of corruption. Cambodia is ranked 161st out of 180 in 2018, according to Transparency International. In part, that's the result of the Khmer Rouge in the 1970s, of course, where a generation of lawyers and teachers and doctors and public officials were murdered by Pol Pot. Levels of stunting and waste among children is high. 1/3 of children have stunted growth. Malnutrition is a big issue, major barrier to growth. And there are wider issues in terms of FDI, particularly into the garment sector, which you may be aware of indeed. Cambodia has to address the issue of safe sourcing, the sort of human rights issues, the employment conditions, the labour market conditions for people working in the garment sector have reached the news recently. It's highly dependent on uncertain remittance flows, so Cambodia essentially needs to gravitate away from its dependence on aid and remittances. And there's also a huge divide between the rural areas and the cities in terms of per capita incomes and disposable incomes. Essentially, Cambodia has built a really labour-intensive competitive advantage in garments, but there are questions about whether that's going to be viable for much longer, particularly in the context of the emergence of new technologies. The plastic pollution crisis is absolutely key and current in Cambodia at the moment. Here's a recent Guardian article. 4 million people in Cambodia, that's 1 person in 5, lacks safe access to drinking water, and they have to buy bottled water. With no systemised widespread waste system, plastic pollution has become a major issue for Cambodia to address. Lots of ways that you can apply Cambodia in your economics exams. The key point about these videos is to give you a sense of context, to make you aware of the countries that are of interest to macroeconomists. So I would use Cambodia as a great example of how to build comparative advantage in garments, but there are risks and drawbacks as well as that. The natural resource base of the country, particularly the national parks and the coastal areas, are under threat from rapid growth, from land degradation and from pollution. What future for low value added manufacturing in a world of increasing use of robotics? Will Cambodia start to deindustrialise prematurely before it's reached middle income status? It's a member of ASEAN. What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks of being part of that economic integration within the Southeast Asian region? How much further can Cambodia turn strong growth into significantly better HDR outcomes, in particular education and health? And yes, a great case study to use in terms of FDI, but is Cambodia too reliant on foreign direct investment, particularly from countries such as China? The bottom line is that Cambodia needs to diversify its economy, and because of that, the country is vulnerable to external events such as big global trade tensions. But it's a really interesting country to study, and it's one that I would definitely have in my revision notes ahead of an A-level exam in macroeconomics.